Hey there! Thank you for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and this is another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, where I review every single fan-created, canonized Bionicle model in the G1 storyline. These are not official sets, but instead they are fan-created mocks that have been officially accepted into the Bionicle storyline either via contests run by LEGO directly, or contests like the TTV Canonization Contest, which are approved by Greg Farshtey, the current story lead and herald of the Bionicle G1 storyline. For today's video, we are taking a look at one of the Dark Hunters in the original Dark Hunter book. This is Conjurer. So a quick rundown of Conjurer's story. He was a warlord from a mysterious island that passed off very advanced technology as magic and used his magic skills to gain a following among Matoran. Unfortunately, since Matoran don't make great invading armies, he really wasn't able to expand outside of the land that he already owned, and so when the Shadowed One approached him and offered to make him a Dark Hunter, he readily accepted but had a plan of his own to take over the Dark Hunters when the Shadowed One wasn't paying attention. Of course, the Shadowed One knows that he is far more powerful than Conjurer, and during an attempt to defy the Shadowed One's commands, he was caught, punished, and had his tail chopped off as a result. Right now, Conjurer is in a deep coma after attempting to absorb the energies of the Makuta of Stelt, which he unfortunately could not do, but he was evacuated onto Spherus Magnus, so he is still around, albeit in a coma. And so without further ado, let's jump into the review. I'll be reviewing these models on 4 main points. Number 1 is posability, so how well can you get it into good poses. Number 2 is building techniques, so are the parts usage unique? Are they using stuff that's just pulled directly from sets, or is there actually something unique going on? Number 3 is overall aesthetics, so how well does this look in general as a model? And number 4 is how well does it fit into the story? And what I mean by that is, does it make sense that this would be a Dark Hunter? Does he fit the description that's been written for him? And so on. So I will mention a few things just going into this review. I am under the belief that this is almost 100% color accurate outside of a few technic beams here and there that are probably just in the wrong shade of gray. I will, however, have to say that I had to add the friction CCBS joint add-ons for his legs here. The reason for this is that it was basically impossible to pose him without it, and he just kept falling over. It really was impossible for me to do the review based on without having these friction adders in. In fact, this is a re-recording of an original first attempt that I did this review because I simply gave up halfway through because he just kept falling over way too many times. So that immediately knocks off a few points off of posability. We'll get into that when I go over the final scores in the end, but just be aware that I did have to add the CCBS friction joints to even be able to make him stand up as he is right now.
I'd like to add as a final note and some minor things that have been altered. The exact gears that have been used on the bottom of his staff have been changed slightly, just simply because I did not have the right gear pieces with me. Hopefully this isn't too big of a deal, but just so you know, these are the correct gear pieces that should have been used. They are the original Toamata/Nuva gears that you should use. The other thing here that you'll notice is that there are a few red studs that have been used on the armor pieces, particularly the flat dark gold armor pieces for the middle part of the arms. I simply accidentally omitted them during the filming of this review. Again, my apologies. Hopefully this doesn't detract too much, but I do mention this later on in the video as well.
But so without further ado, let's just jump right into the review and zoom in on Conjurer the Dark Hunter. Alright, so here is Conjurer in all his glory, again keeping in mind that I did have to add those CCBS friction add-ons to his feet. In fact, starting off with his feet in terms of posability, it really is basically standard, nothing too special going on. You can move the leg up and down, you can bend the knee, and you can rotate the foot pretty much as any other standard figure. The one thing that I will say about this is that the position that the way the Rotuka foot and front claw is attached is not really that secure. You'll notice that it's wobbling around quite a lot when I move this around. I do not think that was intentional articulation, and it is kind of frustrating just getting it straight because it can just get misaligned and look kind of weird, but it only really matters if you're paying close attention to the way it's posed, and otherwise, generally, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, if it gets misaligned, if you don't really notice it, then it doesn't really matter. But that is just one thing that I will mention about the way that the foot is constructed. Doesn't really allow you to have it be a fixed position.
Moving on upwards to the arms, you can see that the two arms are built relatively differently, mostly because one arm is a Rotuka spinner launcher, and the other is a standard hand with a claw and a long weapon. So starting off with the launcher itself, the arms are mounted in a little bit of a strange manner because you have the Metru leg piece here, but that ball joint doesn't go anywhere, and instead you have a kind of connector piece that's stuck onto the Metru leg that allows you to move the elbow. The problem with this is that the way that this armor sits forces the two pieces apart, and the way that it's attached causes it to either droop downwards or be forced downwards. If you actually stick everything tightly together, you can see that once it's stuck tightly together, you really can't bend it past that. So this is really an illegal connection. Well, not quite an illegal connection, but it certainly strains the pieces, especially the way that this armor piece is attached here. You can't really bend the arm outside of one place unless you actually loosen it up a little bit more, then you can bend it out. But then again, having that only partially connected means that it's kind of an illegal connection. So that is a bit of a con, but then other than that, he has a pretty standard forward arm here. I will mention that this in flat dark gold was a remarkably difficult piece to obtain because it only appeared in the Toa Likan and Kikanalo sets. So this cost me around $5 for just this one piece, which is pretty crazy on Bricklink, and for people building it themselves, it's not even that big of a deal. I probably would just recommend that you use a brown one or a black one because it just works with the color scheme. You don't have to break the bank by getting a flat dark gold one. But then moving up, you can see that the way that his Rotuka Launcher is built is actually relatively unique. He uses a Hordika torso, in this case Toa Hordika no Kama's torso, in order to mount the Rotuka spinner on the end here. And you can see that he has multiple claws that can actually hold in the spinner if it was in place. The way that this works is that he would just open up his claws and open up here and then fire the spinner outwards. So that is that. And there are some detailing like a red stud here, just adding on to, I'd say, the magical glow of his armor, or I guess in this case, the high-tech armor that passes off as magic. So I do like the addition of those. And if we move on to the other arm here, that's where things start to get a little bit wonky, at least for me personally, because if you'll notice, he's actually triple jointed on this arm, because he can move the upper arm here, and again, this clearly does not have enough friction to hold or hoist his weapon. It's yet another one of those, but with that aside, you'll notice that his arm, he has his upper arm right here. Nope, that came off again. Okay, let's put this guy back on. That will be a big con against him, posability-wise, but he's got an upper arm, he's got a middle arm segment, and then a lower arm segment, and then a hand. And the hand can rotate freely, the lower arm segment can rotate freely, and the upper arm segment can. So it's kind of a weird setup, and given the fact that he didn't actually have this setup for the other arm, I don't know if that was intentional to kind of give him a more unique look and feel. It just kind of feels out of place to me for him to have so many joints in his arm, and honestly, I could have just done without this whole piece and just have the hand stuck onto the end of this piece here. In fact, I think in terms of proportions, that probably would have made him look even better, because right now as it is, the arm is really long. If you kind of extend it all the way down, it goes down past his knee, which is pretty long, not really in proportion, and I know that a lot of Bionicles have this issue, but that is kind of an issue here, especially with the triple jointed, kind of makes no sense to me. So moving on upwards and looking at the hand itself, obviously you can move his two claws. Not much you can do with the weapon, it's really just a staff, although you can kind of rotate the red galley claws here. And moving up to the head, it's again nothing too crazy. You can rotate it, it's a regular Vaki head. The one interesting thing are the horns here. Unfortunately, they can be very easily wiggled out of place, and again, I do not think that this was intentional for the model to be able to have so much variability in terms of posing. I think that it was just the way that they attached. You can really get it very easily out of place, and in fact, you can very easily cause it to fall off out of the back as well, because if we rotate it on the back here, it's really just stuck in by one pin, so that isn't really that great of a connection. The one thing I do like about this head, though, is the back Rakshi spike actually does make a lot of sense, and the fact that you can flex it and go up and down and kind of make it seem like it's bending as part of his head does kind of add on to the realism of the model and making it look like an actual character. The other thing that I actually do like about this model is the way that the torso is built. I think that using the Liwa Nuva katanas or the Gecko Bird wings in such a manner actually works out really well and gives them a really unique look and feel without actually making it look too different from a Bionicle aesthetic. You'll notice that as they curve around here, these wings are held in by the Borak teeth right here. So it's really helpful to be able to have this as a very sturdy build, and without these two wing pieces, it would feel kind of plain because it's just a Rakshi foot on a Technic build. I think this does a lot in terms of making it seem a lot more realistic and helping the curves of his body make it seem like it has a distinct silhouette, which is always something that's really good to have, especially if you want to kind of set him apart from the other Dark Hunters. Moving around the back, he has a pretty similar type build on the back, another brown Rakshi foot, although he does have some armor in the back as well as a Pohatu Nuva climbing claw, which he uses to kind of bulk up the back here, which I totally don't mind at all. I think that works and fits in relatively well, especially considering the type of Rakshi spine used. It just seems to add on as a continuation as a spike on his back. But then as we wrap up Posability here, there is one thing I have to say, and it is really, really frustrating just getting this guy in different poses. You'll notice that I always have his weapon hoisted on the back here, and again, that's because he simply cannot hold up the weight of his own weapon, which is really frustrating to me. I've yet to find a canon Bionicle build that can really do this, that's wielding a staff. I guess if I put friction joints on every single one of these joints, then he could, but then that kind of defeats the purpose, and I do think that that would add a lot of unnecessary length to the arms that are already really long and gangly to begin with, so that's not really a good solution. It's not like the legs where I could just slap those on and you generally don't notice it. And it's really at every single joint the arm fails here. And the problem with this is that the other thing is that the hand is attached on a simple ball joint that's attached by an axle. So I have actually upgraded this. I'm using the newer type of ball joint. You can see right here, this is the one that has the axle going through. This allows it to have a lot more friction than the older type of ball joint, which was officially used on this model. And the reason for doing that is because when I used the older type of ball joint, his hand just kept falling off at every turn. And the problem is, as you can just see, when his hand falls, it really can just tip the whole body and cause the whole thing to fall. The good thing is that outside of the hand falling off, it's really not that fragile. You're not going to have to keep on reassembling this when it falls over. It's just really annoying getting him into any sort of good pose. And unless you really angle the weapon, maybe balance it on his leg here, maybe then you can get it to kind of a stance where he's pointing outwards and brandishing it, but it's kind of a struggle. And even with the Rotuka spinner, which is ideally something that you should be able to pose like he's launching, it just keeps on falling down due to a lack of friction up in the arm here. And that's something that's really frustrating to me because I figured it'd be a really good pose. If he cannot pose this arm, at least let him be able to fire his spinner and have it in a menacing position like that. And you can't even do that. And again, you'll notice that by moving this arm around, this piece is getting weakened because it's only being held in by one pin. So I have to keep reattaching this piece. And if I reattach it tightly, you can't move this arm outwards that much. If you really reattach it that tight, you can see you can't really bend it past this angle. If you do bend it past that angle, then it pushes the pin out again, then you risk the arm falling off. So that is a major con to me, just the lack of being able to pose this well at all. You can immediately see he's just falling over. No matter what I do, you really have to really mess with it to pose it. And again, this is after putting the friction joints in the leg, so you can imagine that the first time I tried to film this review, how hard it was to even be able to get him in a pose standing in front of me without those friction joints there. So posability-wise, it's kind of a mess, and I do think that at least some of the blame has to be attributed to the old LEGO friction joints, which of course are these T-pieces here. In fact, I'll remove one just to show you. These pieces were very notorious by LEGO because they introduced them in order to add friction, but unfortunately what ended up happening is that the rubber decayed really quickly, and after a year or two of use, or even less, they ended up functioning even worse than the regular ball and socket joints. In fact, they took friction away from the models. And I was really shocked that these pieces were used all the way up into Bionicle's later years, and I think the reason for it is that they never actually made a ball and socket joint that had this socket here and the axle hole running through. They only made the ones that you could put the axle in perpendicularly, and they just decided to keep on reusing this piece because it was the only one that they had. But this piece is used on pretty much every joint in the legs, and I think that's what causes it to be really, really unstable, because obviously this was well before the time of putting piston add-ons or whatnot that real Titans have in the real Bionicle Titan sets. They have the piston add-ons to give it real friction. These pieces really just don't do the job that well, and that's a major con against this model, but also against LEGO too, because LEGO, if you're gonna introduce a piece that adds friction to a model, it should add friction and not take friction away, which is what it actually does here. But then moving on from the posability, which I will admit is relatively weak, we now are approaching the aesthetics point. And that is actually one thing that I do like about this model for the most part. I love the way that they use these transparent red studs to highlight certain glows of magic around him, and I feel like that really fits into his backstory of using his advanced technology to trick Matoran into thinking that he was performing acts of magic. Again, you have his transparent red heartlight here, which lines up with these, lines up with this, and I think that is a really nice addition that the builder really didn't need to go that extra mile to give this model, but they decided to do anyway. And then the other thing is that I think that the color scheme, outside of a few things, is actually pretty consistent. You have the brown, which works surprisingly well with flat dark gold, as well as this burnt orange color or dark orange color from the Gecko bird, which actually blends in really well with how the rest of the model works itself. The one thing that does feel a little bit out of place to me though is the dark blue. And I can highly suspect why they included this dark blue. I know for sure that they had a Kreka set, and the builder of this just decided to take pieces of the Kreka set and use it for this model. I know this because the way that the mouth is built, it uses this Technic beam in dark blue. Now that beam in dark blue only comes in the Kreka set in this exact configuration to give a tooth to the Vaki-headed mouth. And again, you have kind of this forced dark blue included in the color scheme, but only on the ends of the arms. So we've got a dark blue Nuva armor piece here, and then you've got a dark blue Nokama Hordika body here as the Rotuka Spinner Launcher. And I can't help but think how much better this would have looked and more cohesive if, say, they used the Oniwa Hordika body, which was the same shade of brown, and they just used maybe just a silver Nuva shoulder, which is more common than the dark blue one anyway. I feel like the use of this dark blue piece and this dark blue piece is only really included just to offset the dark blue used in the mouth here, and I feel like it's not enough spread across the body to be really highlighted as an accent color like some other colors do work well by really deviating from the color scheme. This one is an example where I feel like it doesn't really work out that well. And another thing with aesthetics, again, I actually do like the unique vibe of the way that this Rotuka Spinner is built. I do appreciate the parts usage and the way that it looks on his arm. It does look like a large cannon that he's pointing outwards. But however, the way that this arm is built, I'm not a big fan of, especially just because of how easy it is to, well, one, to have the hand fall off, and two, to just get it out of whack. You have to really try to position it well enough to make it look like a continuous arm, and then again, this is very clearly 3 joints and then a 4th joint for the arm. So that feels a little bit strange to me and out of place. I could have done without this whole part again, and I do feel like that does work against this model, although overall I think that the aesthetics-wise portion of this build is generally pretty good outside of the dark blue, because I do like the color scheme. We don't get many brown colored villains, and this one is a pretty unique one and built relatively interestingly with the dark orange or burnt orange being used particularly well as a highlight color. So it's a bit of a mixed bag on aesthetics to me. But now let's zoom out and compare this guy against some other representative samples in the Bionicle universe.
Alright, so now that we've zoomed out, we can take a look at Conjurer and how well he fits in with the rest of the Bionicle universe. I have brought over Voparak, a fellow Dark Hunter, a time-sensitive one. They have quite a similar head design. Voparak also uses the Vaki head and has kind of this spike sticking out of it, so I felt like they were pretty comparable to each other, as well as the Shadowed one, who he has fought a few times and is currently serving under him. So we've got the Shadowed one here, Voparak here, and Conjurer, and honestly I think the way that this is built actually does fit in quite well with the other Dark Hunters. They're all around the same height, and you can clearly see the design influence of the Vaki head kind of sharing similarities between them, especially when you take a look at Voparak's side profile next to him. You can really see how this head is shaped here. He has a spike in the back, very similar to how Conjurer has his. So I do actually appreciate the way this is done, and I think that it does fit in quite well with the Bionicle universe. That being said, there are a few things about it that throw me off just general aesthetics wise, but that is a separate point other than fitting in the universe. And I think in terms of fitting in, it does so very well, because the color scheme isn't too crazy, it looks relatively realistic. The flat dark gold can be simply seen as armor. It's not like a major part of his color scheme, so it doesn't detract too much. And even the dark blue maybe can be excused a little bit just in terms of being a highlight, so I do feel like in terms of fitting in the Bionicle universe, this one does pretty well. But setting aside these two Dark Hunters, let's just summarize all 4 points for the review. So in terms of fitting in with the Bionicle universe, I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10. There are a few things that throw me off, but in general, when compared next to one of the other Dark Hunters like Voprak, for example, it does fit in pretty well next to each other, and I could very easily see them working together and being part of the same faction, which honestly is all that matters when you're making a Dark Hunter. But then unfortunately we do have to discuss some of the more negative aspects, and that brings us to Posability. So, Posability. If you have the friction joints in, which is a little bit of a cheat, it's not too bad leg-wise. But then the arms still cannot really do anything, and the way that the arms are built means that you can't even bend them out any further than they should without straining the pieces. So that's a big con in Posability, as well as the fact that if I took the friction add-ons out, then it would just keep on falling over and be even worse than it is right now. So with all of that in consideration, I think I'm going to give Posability a 5 out of 10. And this is the lowest Posability score I've given any model so far. You can already see him falling over there. And I do think that the reason that this isn't lowered is because I have almost all the Dark Hunters built, and believe me, there are ones that are far worse than this in terms of Posability. And in order to keep that on a ranking scale in mind, I'm giving this a 5 out of 10 average scale. Again, there's stuff that you can't bend the arms without damaging the pieces or pushing the pieces out in order to be able to bend the arms, which is really a bit of a cheat. The legs just are really not sturdy whatsoever and keep falling over, mostly due to the friction joints that really take away friction for the G1 friction joints. And the fact that you can't do anything with the weapon whatsoever without it just flopping around, and the weird triple jointedness of the arm, the strange positioning of this weapon here, and also the fact that you can't really position this at all either because they'll just keep on falling over like so. All these points I feel really detract a lot from the model, and unfortunately it takes what is a generally visually cohesive model that looks threatening and looks pretty cool and makes it nearly impossible to play with or do anything with because you just can't pose it well. And so coming directly off of Posability, we have, of course, building techniques. Now, I think I'm a little bit more positive on this one than I was with Posability, mostly because I actually do genuinely like how the torso is built. I love the use of the dark orange Liwa Nuva katanas to make up the bulk of his torso and show us detailed spikes on the back. I mentioned before in the review I like the way that the Rakshi spine attaches on the back here. And I actually do appreciate the way that unique techniques are used to put together the Rotuka Launcher arm, which uses, again, the Hordika no Kama torso as a part of a launcher for a large figure. I think that's a pretty unique use of that piece, and I haven't actually seen that piece used like that before, so I will give it kudos for that. However, there are some things that will be taken away for Posability. Again, you've got the really weird connection here that, one, if it's really stuck together firmly, prevents you from even moving the arm whatsoever. And you can only move it outwards if you kind of remove this flat dark gold armor piece or only just very gently place it in. Then you can really move the arm, but that's a big con and takes a lot away from the building techniques, the way that it's really restrictive in the way it's built. And then the strange triple jointed arm here and the way that the hand is attached such that it's very easy to fall off, those all count against it. So again, a bit of a mixed bag. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 in terms of building techniques. And again, this has really benefited from a really cool torso design, which I do actually appreciate. The legs, if you ignore the fact that they have no friction, actually do look pretty sturdy. And while it does just steal the Kikanalo leg technique, it actually does it with different colors and whatnot and tries to spice things up a little bit. But then you get to the cons of the wiggly feet. You can't really position those well. Same with the horns, they kind of wiggle around. Triple jointed arm. You've got a really strange way that the upper arms are attached. So it's really a mixed bag, but I'm generally a little bit more positive than average. And then the final point is overall aesthetics. And this is where it's going to get the highest score from me, 7 out of 10. And I really do think that aesthetics overall, outside of the really weird dark blue on the mouth and the upper arms, it's generally very cohesive and looks good as a Dark Hunter. You can see the dark orange fitting in really well with the Metru brown and the flat dark gold as highlight armor pieces, and even the silver blends in pretty well as feet and whatnot. So I do think that this is done very well in terms of the color scheme outside of the dark blue, and even going around to the back, it really keeps that color scheme consistent. And I think the fact that it has these red highlights of the system parts where they were attached actually does add this kind of magical feel to him, and it could very easily be interpreted as lights on technology that Matoran could have believed was magic. So I do think that the way that the backstory fits in with how this is designed actually does work very well for the model, and in terms of overall aesthetics, that does really give it a boost. So despite some strange oddities, I do think that overall aesthetics-wise, it is pretty good. But with that, that about sums up the review of the Dark Hunter Conjurer. Definitely a mixed bag. I'm going to say I was a little bit let down by this one. It looked really cool in the images, and I was really excited to get this into really good poses. But unfortunately, after I realized that I really can't do anything with the arms, that did take a lot of excitement out of it, although it is still a good build, and if you do fiddle with it a lot, you can get it into relatively decent poses. You just kind of have to mess with it and play around with the model. So would I recommend for you to build this yourself? Only if you really want to own all the Dark Hunters and don't mind posing it. It's not like some of the other much worse Dark Hunters where I really wouldn't recommend even building them unless you want to own them all. This one kind of falls in between. I wouldn't build it for fun, but if you're wanting to own a few of the Dark Hunters and have a cool looking figure on your shelf, I'd say maybe go for it and just play around with the posing, maybe put friction joints everywhere and see how it goes. But that about sums up this review. Thank you so much for tuning in, and stay tuned to Duckbricks for even more LEGO and Bionicle news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.